Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our fourth fourth event of the academic year at the HRC in the series Meet VCU Authors. And I think we can still say Happy Latin Heritage Month, right? This month has a
Yeah.
sort of weird timing, right?
Yeah, it sort of overlaps between September, October.
September, October. So I think we are still within the confines. So happy Latin Heritage Month. My name is Cristina Stanch. I'm a professor of English here, and I direct the Humanities Research Center. And as many of you who attend these talks regularly know, this series invites members of the Richmond community, as well as colleagues and students from VCU and from other universities to meet VCU authors as they talk about their publications and answer questions about their work. And it's also a time of celebration because many publications take many years to complete. I'm just so delighted that today is a little different because our speaker is an MFA student, and you learn more about his work in a second. But I couldn't be happier to host Josh Galarza today. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we dive right in. As you know, our virtual events follow a more or less similar format. I will first introduce our guest who will speak for about 35-40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. And please use either the chat or the Q&A function on your screens to post your question, to make your remarks, and then we'll get to the questions in the order in which they're received. And as always, many thanks to Rani Sisavat for setting this up for publicity. We would not be here without Rani, so thank you, Rani. Um, I am just so delighted to introduce our speaker today, Josh Galarza, whose new book, I'm going to try to hold it here, but okay, I think it works. Whose new book, The Great Cool Ranch Dorito in the Sky, was published earlier this year by Henry Holt, which is an imprint of Macmillan, as Josh tells me, and the Books for Young Readers division. And as you may have read in VCU News on October 1st, Josh's debut novel, this novel is one of the 5 finalists for the 2024 National Book Award for Young People's Literature. And in our conversation right before this event, we learned that November 20th is the day, right? So
Yeah, the live event.
a live event, and if we have a link, I'm sure many of us will tune in. So congratulations, Josh, and thank you so much for sharing your time and the novel with us today. And thank you so much to all of you attending, and to those of you who attended last Wednesday's discussion organized by the Dean's Office, where Josh joined Annie Haynos, who's an assistant professor in psychology, and Shanna Green, the director of VCU University Student Health Services, for a discussion around the many faces of disordered eating, which explored the manifestations of disordered eating and pathways to recovery. Today's talk, however, is very different. It's about the research influences of this novel. And I'm very happy to hear more about the research that went into the production of this novel. If you don't know Josh, Josh is an MFA candidate in the VCU Creative Writing Program, where he also teaches. He's a writer, printmaker, and book artist, originally from Northern Nevada, and he writes fiction and creative nonfiction. He's also a multidisciplinary visual artist specializing in printmaking and book arts. And his research, as you'll learn more today, centers around male gender performance, queer issues, body liberation, and Chicano studies. And he is, as he confesses, and I read this on the blurb, he is 3 times champion of extreme trampoline air drumming, a sport that he invented himself. Josh, welcome to Meet VC Authors, and congratulations. So happy to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Christina. I'm really grateful, and I'm really grateful to the Humanities Research Center for hosting these incredible events. And it's such an honor. It's a rare thing for a creative author like myself to get to dive deep into the research aspect of what we do. So often our interviews, focus on plot and character, and that's going to come into this talk. But it's really exciting for me, even over the last few days, just to go back over the last like 5 or 6 years worth of my life researching men and masculinity, and finding the ways that are really sometimes subtle and sometimes profound that it manifests in this novel and in my greater artist practice. So I'm really, really grateful to be here. I'll start by sharing my screen. Let's hope I do this right. I did it right in the practice, so all right. So yeah, so that's my book, The Great Cool Ranch Dorito in the Sky. And just a quick premise, which helps to contextualize the talk. Unwilling to face the frightening reality of his mother's cancer, 15-year-old Brett Harrison escapes into the comic book stories he pens while funneling his anxieties into an escalating eating disorder. When Brett's disorder becomes public knowledge, he can no longer hide from the painful truths of his real-life narrative and must find the strength to face even the most unfathomable loss bravely. Um, and a lot of times, yeah, in the interviews that I do around this book, we talk a lot about the escalating eating disorder aspect of the story. And I'll touch briefly on that now, just for context. Brett's disordered eating, which is primarily binge disorder that eventually morphs into bulimia, is similar, if not exactly the same as my own. I had an eating disorder that began at Brett's age when I was in my mid-teens, and it followed me into my 20s. And like most men, I was completely unaware of what was going on. In my 20s, the eating disorder was primarily orthorexia, and that's extreme healthism and extreme restriction, sort of around that healthism, extreme exercise. So you have a culture that's lauding you for, performing masculinity well, for starters, when you're at the gym twice a day or whatever. And eating clean and all of these ways we frame that restrictive behavior. um but also, yeah, it was about trying to have an appropriate male body as well. Like, what is the body that we laud for men? And you'll see how that kind of comes into play in the story as we move forward, and some of the anxieties that this protagonist Brett experiences. And fortunately, in my mid-30s, I was able to go back to college to finish a BFA in art and a BA in writing in English at the University of Nevada, Reno. And my eating disorder at that point was escalating and morphing into bulimic behaviors. And that is something I recognized. My life had been kind of spiraling out of control for a long time, and I didn't understand why. And yet that bulimic behavior, and in hindsight, I often think of that was like it's almost like a cry for help. Like most men, I couldn't simply ask for help. I couldn't say I was suffering or struggling. Because I have to be in control all the time, and I have to, have all the answers, and I have to be incredibly self-reliant. But the escalation in some ways, I think, was sort of subconsciously, if I'm self-destructive enough, people will notice. If I'm self-destructive enough, people might intervene. And I find that psychologically really fascinating aspect of what I was doing at that time. But luckily, I had access to incredible resources at the university, and so I was able to get into treatment right away, and had a really dedicated treatment team of therapist and doctor and dietitian. And they, really held me accountable and worked with me in a very outpatient way for a few years while I was at the university, and really healed what was going on with me. And at the same time, I was needing to write a book because I'm in writers' workshops. And so suddenly there's this teenage boy in my head, and he's so annoying. But I kind of realized he was sort of charming. And I didn't understand why I wanted to write from a teenage perspective. I'd never done that before. But I think as the talk goes on, you'll discover what I discovered, which this has to do with compassion. I was very hard on myself, beating myself up constantly. And when I applied some of the things I was struggling with to a teenage boy, I couldn't feel anything but compassion for him. And that was a way to, without realizing what I was doing, maybe to teach myself to be compassionate towards myself. And that was a necessary part of healing, which we'll talk more about. So, to get into the connection, though, to men, I was in treatment. One of the things that shocked me was my therapist, who by this point I really trusted, suggested that I join their men's issues group therapy. And I thought, this guy has to, he's lost his mind. Um, how am I, this gay man who has often felt apart from other men, um, how am I supposed to sit in a room with a bunch of straight guys and talk about my insecurities and my destructive behaviors? How am I going to connect to these people? But I really trusted my therapist at that point, and I just thought, okay, I have to give it a try and see what happens. And what I observed in that group really shocked me because it sort of contradicted the prevailing ideas about men I'd once bought into as readily as anyone else. These ideas that the man is an oppressive, exploitative monster, deserving of his shame and his guilt and his self-hatred. Um, and what I saw instead were these deeply compassionate, sensitive, intuitive, emotive men who were really committed to supporting each other. And it immediately became my favorite part of my week. This was like a weekly meeting, and it was kind of an overnight thing where I was like, this is going to change my life if I show up and I let it, right? So I was really fascinated by the connection I was making with these other men and the overlap I was seeing in their life struggles, what had brought them maybe to group, and my own, which I had not until this time really recognized as something to do with masculine performance. At the same time, I was working at a library, and I just remember walking past one of the bookshelves, and they had on display this book, and it was by Dr. Herb Goldberg, and it was uh, excuse me, it was not this one. It was the book that just before this one, and it was The Hazards of Being Male. And it had the most ridiculous subtitle, which was Surviving the Myth of Masculine Privilege. And this book looked old, right? And when I picked it up, I discovered, it was published in the 70s. And I just thought, I cannot wait to sit down and laugh at, how backwards this book is. It's probably a bunch of men's rights stuff. It's probably really misogynistic. But I was just so intrigued. And that couldn't have been further from the truth. I think if this book were published today, it would have a different subtitle. But publishing is all about like how do you sell the book, right? So this sequel, The New Male, which you see on your screen, this is not the real subtitle, but this is From Macho to Sensitive, but Still All Male. It's kind of cringe. It's embarrassing, but publishing at that time are saying to themselves, well, if within this book there are actually messages about healing men and about liberating men from their masculine performance, how do we get men to pick this up? Because they're not going to do that if we try to undermine if they think that we're undermining their sense of manhood, right? So I think it's really kind of funny how these subtitles shift in relation to the culture of the time, because we're going to look at another book here in a moment that is doing a lot of the same things as Dr. Goldberg's books, but doing it within the last few years. And you'll see a subtitle there that is very of our moment, and I think that's really intriguing. But anyway, so I had to eat my words because as I started reading, I was blown away by what Dr. Goldberg had to say. And one of the things that he says is that the blueprint for masculinity is a blueprint for self-destruction. It is a process so deeply embedded in the male consciousness, however, that awareness of its course and its end has been lost. The masculine imperative, the pressure and compulsion to perform, to prove himself, to dominate, to live up to the masculine ideal, in short, to be a man, supersedes the instinct to survive. That is a really intense situation, but it struck me based on what I was experiencing in my own sort of self-destruction, which had been going on and evolving for a long time and spiraling into disaster at this point in my life, that rang true to me. And it rang true in relation to what I was learning about these actual other real men in this group I was in. So the stakes seemed really high. And it got me thinking about my own stakes in the game of masculine, exploration of masculinity. And so currently, I am working on a nonfiction thesis along with my new fiction book, which we'll talk more about later, I'm sure. But I wanted to read you just a tiny snippet from my nonfiction thesis to just give you a little sense, a little window into the stakes for me in this research, why it matters so much to me. So this is just a couple paragraphs. Sometimes when I'm feeling strong enough to work on processing the trauma of being male, I'll sit alone in a quiet space and allow myself to feel the weight of a particular pile of memories that have shaped my understanding of myself as a man. One cringeworthy moment after another will play out in my mind, stretching back to early childhood. These memories include the time a girl in my sixth grade class taught me how to kick a ball so the other boys might stop making fun of me. Another involves a time I gave my first talk to a crowd of hundreds of Montessori teachers at a national conference, the beginning of a successful bid to make a name for myself in my field. For years afterward, I couldn't step up to a lectern without picturing the anonymous comment card that had been filled out in pink ink. Your sing-song voice is offensive to children. One of the earliest of these memories involves me running into the house from my backyard. I'm 8 years old and sporting my favorite sweatbands and leg warmers stolen from my sister's Get in Shape Girl aerobics kit. I'm weeping, blubbering about the evil machinations of my sister, who has just torpedoed my genitals with a basketball. Anyone with male sex organs can tell you the extremity of my pain. Some might faint just thinking about it. But my grandfather, the man raising me, doesn't wait long enough to hear why I'm crying. He only hears the weakness in my tears, an indication of the weakness of my spirit. He throws his hands up and yells three simple words: "You're a boy." In this memory, my grandfather and I, like so many fathers and sons before us, exchange an entire conversation in a split second. His exclamation details his discomfort, shame, and even fear that I've once again proven myself less than male, a sissy, a pansy, a girl. Evidence that I am already failing as a specimen of my gender and will surely, without drastic intervention, grow into a failure of a man. Here I'd like to make an important distinction. The boy in this memory, now a man of 40, might yet grow into a successful person, but person is not synonymous with man. To patriarchal society, the latter is far more important than the former, a point well illustrated in my experience in men's group therapy, where my group mates regularly spoke of their desire to be good men or better men, never good people or better people. As I observed and quickly adopted this quirk of the male lexicon, I realized that regardless of what we hoped to achieve, none among us was willing to jeopardize his carefully cultivated maleness to get it. Being a man was more important than being human, a fact that could, regardless of our varied histories, explain why we'd found ourselves in group to begin with. Our diction belied our true repressed need to live lives that valued our humanity over our gender. I draw this distinction because my life experience and now my research suggests that being a successful man actually comes at the price of one's humanity, and I believe this price is too high to pay. When I refer to the trauma of being male, I'm not speaking melodramatically or colloquially. I'm speaking of the devastating and nearly universal psychological, physiological, and sociological effects of the masculine experience. So I was learning a lot about those effects in Dr. Goldberg's works. But of course, any researcher knows, like, oh my gosh, I cannot really like build my whole, frame of research around research that is this old, right? I need to, really start reading broadly. And so right around that same time, a book came out that was mirroring a lot of what Dr. Goldberg had been saying 40 years ago, and it's by journalist Liz Plank. And her book, For the Love of Men, and I just really want to draw your attention to that subtitle, A New Vision for Mindful Masculinity. So what was disturbing about reading this book in comparison to Goldberg is that we haven't come very far in 40 years for men. And that has a lot to do with men not wanting to buy into doing this healing work and rejecting patriarchy and helping to dismantle it. There's this fear-based behavior, right, that keeps men sort of stuck in what Goldberg calls the harness of masculinity. Um, but I was so happy to see, okay, well, we've come far enough at least that on a book about the masculinity crisis, we can have a subtitle that's using very much like a buzzword, a therapy buzzword of our moment, which is mindfulness, and how can we validate ourselves as men, and yet not behave in these traditional harmful ways, right? Um, and Liz Plank, on the very first page of this book, she was describing recent actions taken by the American Psychological Association in an effort to better serve the needs of men and boys. And this had not really happened in the past, because the idea of who is in special need of services were people who were seen as vulnerable, right? So members of the queer community, racial minority groups, women. Um, but when you think of the most privileged group in our society, that's just the baseline. So for a long, long time, even the American Psychological Association wasn't really paying attention to and targeting these issues with male performance and the way men live. Um, this report in the APA warns therapists about the dangers of traditional masculine ideology negatively impacting men's mental health, as well as physical health and well-being. And one of the most powerful lines in this whole book comes towards the end of that chapter. Although the news often, or excuse me, just at the end of that page, right? Although the news often focuses on the threats of terrorism, natural disasters, and nuclear war, there is no greater threat to humankind than our current definition of masculinity. And one of the things that was a little challenging when I started out on this research path was like, if I talk about men's liberation and if I talk about men's issues, and if I try to have compassion for men, will people just think I'm like a men's rights activist? Will people misunderstand and not recognize that what I was beginning to already recognize, that this is feminist work, in fact. But it's really validating. Then at the time when Herb Goldberg was writing his books, there was a lot of within the feminist movement making fun, poking fun of men who were trying to do this kind of work, and a lot of resentment toward them. And some of that persists today, but I think Liz Plank's book is evidence that those attitudes are shifting in a really good way. And I think it's important to see validation from women. Um, and that's something that's an aspect of the Great Cool Ranch Dorito in the Sky as well. The character Brett, as he is struggling, he is not socialized to understand his eating disorder well, or a lot of his misguided behaviors that are sort of driven by the way he's policed into male performance. But a girl at school, Mallory, who he eventually who befriends him, she takes him under her wing and acts as a mentor to him. And I really admire this about Mallory because she's a printmaker. She's got this robust artist practice. She's got a job outside of school. She's like a really busy person with a lot going on. And yet she is compassionate enough to see someone who doesn't understand, because when you're in the center of society, you don't see the forest for the trees very well. You don't see yourself well, but someone who's further on the outskirts can. And that's why it's so important, I think, for men on this journey, right? To really be listening to women, listen to the stories of women, be grateful for female mentorship where you can get it. And a lot of men, even ones who support women outwardly, there's this sort of underlying, maybe even subconscious disregard for the expertise of women, and sort of lauding powerful men and seeking mentorship in that way, when really we should be so lucky to be mentored by women, right? So that's just something that I thought was interesting about who is involved in this conversation now. And we see a lot more women who are leading that charge and men more willing to listen to them. And I think that that's really good. Um, okay, so back to Goldberg for a minute. Um, So Planck talks about, Liz Planck talks about uh, the negative behavioral and health effects of masculine performance, and how men basically are dying at sooner, younger than women do. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but one of them has to do with risky behavior, and that's prompted by not by a natural inclination towards risk within men, because that just doesn't exist, but by the belief in a natural male inclination to risk. And that's a psychological conundrum further complicated by male privilege, access to resources and opportunity, which allow men, especially white men, to literally jeopardize less than women and men of color when engaging in dangerous behavior. And some of that shows up in the Great Cool Ranch Dorito in the Sky, where we just see these, we see a protagonist who's behaving in really risky ways with alcohol. He's beginning to experiment with alcohol as a coping mechanism and making really poor choices. We also see his best buddy, his best friend, who likes to kind of get them into these adventures that are sort of fun to read on the page, but really like trouble in real life, right? Like this could turn very easily towards a path of crime and towards a path that ends you up in jail or something. So they're on a razor's edge, I think, at this age, boys are. And some of that has to do with their need to perform that way. And so Goldberg says uh, that the lost my place. Lost my place in my notes, but I'll try to read it off the screen here. The nature of masculinity is such that the male is unable to even recognize that he's in hazard. His life seems to him to be totally in his control. Unaccustomed to self-examination, he blocks out awareness about the way he lives and the conditioning that created it. He stoically accepts his lot as a given, or as best a challenge that the real man will accept and cope with, and only the sissy will not. So this is that impossible bind and that harness that the man is in. And Goldberg also talked about something that really blew my mind, which is what he calls the body psychotic condition. And that really undergirded some of my BFA thesis in printmaking, or like the entirety of my BFA thesis. And Goldberg, he talks about how through this performance and through the policing into male behavior, the boy's body and spirit, and the mind and the spirit are basically like ripped apart. And I see this as this really violent act. And so as the boy ages, this conditioning makes it easier and easier to disregard his own safety and health in pursuit of male performance, not because he's growing more foolish with the years, but more disembodied. And so this is kind of an abstract idea. But Goldberg says the nature of masculinity. Oh, I already read it. See that? Now I found my place. There it is. I just got behind myself. But men have lost touch with their bodies. In effect, one could say they have no body, in the same way the psychotic personality has lost a sense of self and has no self. And so within my thesis work, I was creating these sculptures where I'm ripping the intellect and the ego, which is what's going to drive a man throughout his life, and attaching that to appropriate male bodies. So there's this disembodiment thing that happens, and that's done in this really violent way. And these, characters, I called them Team Toxic. They all represented these toxic aspects of male performance. And because I was thinking about how this begins in very early childhood, this conditioning, I came up with these little nursery rhymes for each character. Toxic Toby's their leader. I'm Toxic Toby, Chevalier. I live for your protection. When I grow up, I'll play my part. I'll be a fire engine. In other words, I have to be a hero because that's what it means to be a man. Or I'm Noxious Ned. I want it all. There's no filling my tank. When I grow up, I'll play my part. I'll be a piggy bank. So this gets into like the greed and that sense of nothing is ever enough because there's always a competition, and there's always every success is just like the next stepping stone towards something greater. And is it ever enough? So uh, one of the other really incredible pieces of research that I came upon was The Mask You Live In, which is a documentary film by Jennifer Seibel Newsom. And many experts are in this, featured in this film. But one of them who stood out to me was Dr. William Pollack, and he's a psychologist and director of the Centers for Men and Young Men. So he's really versed in boys and what's happening at this particular moment in their lives. Um, and how they're starting to lose their ability to communicate in intimate ways and in vulnerable ways, and they're disconnecting from their emotions. And he says boys are not encouraged to talk about any kind of pain with anyone else. And when they do talk about pain, fathers particularly, but mothers also, tend to focus more on how to solve the problem or what they're going to do or their actions. The way boys are brought up makes them hide their natural, vulnerable, and empathetic feelings behind a mask of masculinity. When they're most in pain, they can't reach out and ask for help because they're not allowed to, or they won't be a real boy. They're shamed into this, and they're very ashamed to break out of it. And I'm thinking about in the Great Cool Ranch Dorito how this in the sky how this starts to play out. Um, so uh, I'm just gonna read a very short little section where one of Brett's friends is trying to support him, but Brett isn't really able to let him. Um, Reed says, "We can talk about it if you want. You can talk to me." And Brett has just woken up from a bad dream, and they share a bedroom. So his friend had heard the noises he was making in his sleep. We can talk about it if you want. You can talk to me. All I want to do is say yes. I say it was just a bad dream. Reed's voice isn't as cavalier as I'm used to. Would you just talk to me? You're shutting me out, and it feels like shit. I'm your brother. I'll always be your brother. This is the closest Reed has ever come to punching me in the gut. I kind of wish he had. There's a little bit of a flashback here, so I won't read all of that. But then back in that current moment, Reed means it when he says he'll always be my brother, but that doesn't make his words true, at least not outside the metaphorical sense that will one day see us from stardust to stardust. I try to say, I want to talk about Evelyn. Can we talk about Evelyn? And that's his adoptive mother who is ill. I try to say, I don't know how to fix this food thing. I try to say, I'm ashamed, but I choke on the words. I say, I'm good, really. Let's go back to sleep, okay? And that goes on to some conflict there because, Brett is, uh, Reed can see Brett's behavior spiraling, but Brett, sort of refuses to accept what uh, John and Julie Gottman, haha, psychologists and the founders of the Gottman Institute would call a bid for connection. So uh, what they say, what John says in his book, The Relationship Cure, he says, what happens in relationships where people consistently turn toward another's bids for connection? Well, over time, they develop stable, long-lasting relationships, rich in good feelings for one another. They also seem to have easier access to humor, affection, and interest in one another during conflict, a factor that allows them to stay connected emotionally, solve problems, and avoid the downward spiral of negative feelings that destroy relationships. Um, and I discovered John and Julie Gottman through the Unlocking Us with Brene Brown podcast. And so one of my therapists recommended Brene Brown's A Call to Courage, which is on Netflix, and I highly recommend it. And this was kind of the moment when Brene Brown was sort of blowing up and taking over the world. And I became so obsessed with her work. And I just thought, God, if like all men would just become obsessed with Brene Brown's work, that'd be the end of patriarchy. And of course it is more complicated than that. And I, as a person of color, especially recognize that there are really important aspects of the oppressed person's experience that need to be considered too. And Brene Brown actually does a pretty good job of that as a white person. But we need more voices than hers, but boy, is her voice effective. And she's talking about she's a shame researcher and a vulnerability researcher. So that's like right up my alley based on what I'm trying to write about and what I'm trying to practice in group therapy with other men and who I'm trying to become. And when I think about what was driving Brett to like avoid opening up to his buddy in that scene or in others, is this shame that he feels around the eating disorder and the shame that he feels about his struggles. Um, And so uh, Brene Brown states, shame is the intensely painful feeling oops, let me find it on my notes because I can't see it as well here. You can maybe see it better than me. But what I have in my notes, now that I'm finding it, is shame is highly correlated with addiction, depression, violence, aggression, bullying, suicide, and eating disorders. Um, and yeah, Brene Brown is getting to the idea that it's this feeling of believing that we are unworthy of love and unworthy of connection. And so it's really a dangerous feeling and clearly feeding into, this character's behavior in my book. Um, and we'll talk a little more about Desmond Tutu later in this talk towards the end. But as I was learning from Brene Brown and obsessing over her podcast, I thought of one of his very famous quotes, which says, there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. Um, and so some of my research questions really started to focus on the roots of this masculine performance, and I realized that this book about a boy healing is very much a book about a boy reclaiming what he's lost and becoming who he is authentically, and that's all hard work for any boy, um, simply because oops yeah. Uh, because of what we can learn in Dr. Michael Kimmel's work in this book called Guyland. And he's a sociologist and he focuses particularly on teen boys and this like period of time where you're heading into manhood. Um, and he says anti-gay sentiments become a shorthand method of gender policing. And one survey found that most American boys would rather be punched in the face than called gay. Tell a boy what he's doing or wearing is gay, and the gender police have just written him a ticket. If he persists, they might have to lock him up. Um, and so all of this like masculine performance stuff becomes really important, and that can uh, manifest in the way boys begin to objectify girls and disrespect girls, and in that reckless behavior we've talked about. In this book, we do see some of that objectification that happens. Brett has a crush at school, and he's not quite seeing her as fully human yet, even though he's on his way towards that. But he sees her and objectifies her in the way that a lot of teen boys might. And so one of the lessons that he has to learn is to really always remember to think of girls and women as people first, and as possible romantic interests, somewhere further down that list. But part of the reason the boy will make the comments he does to his buddies and things has to do with that need to I need to prove my heterosexuality. And even gay men, I noticed, just myself and my experience, I recognized that I wasn't liberated from this. That sometimes when you are gay and you're seen as feminine, you will overcompensate sometimes by overachieving in other ways. And so there was a lot of masculine performance stuff happening within me that wasn't real, but it was sort of a pushback against the discrimination I experienced as a gay teen and as a gay man, into my 20s, when at a time in history, right, that was, deeply, deeply homophobic. So another aspect of this that I think is so interesting is coming from Dr. Niobe Way, who is a developmental psychologist and professor. And what she has to say has to do with boys and how they start to see each other as competition. So they start to lose the ability to rely on each other the way that girls do. So girls are socialized in this way that when there's a crisis, they have this rich support system. It's not just I can go to my boyfriend. He's the only one who understands and can support me. Well, boys in their mid-teens start to lose that ability because they can't trust other boys. And so she says, starting when they're about 15, 16, 17, the language shifts. You hear boys talking about the struggles in their friendships, being hurt by other boys or feeling betrayed by other boys, wanting to have these intimate friendships, but not knowing how to find them. They enter in a culture of masculinity that makes this bizarre equation that male intimacy has to be about sexuality. And any sign of intimacy is going to be perceived as potentially gay. They understand that if you're straight, you have no desire for male intimacy. We don't do that with women. We do that with men. And so that was one reason I wanted to write about straight boys in this book, was because I really wanted to try to undermine this horrible thing that happens at this time. And of course, this is a big part of that, like, disconnection that's happening between the boy's emotions or spirit and his intellect and his ego. Um, so to me, writing this book with a straight male protagonist was kind of an important choice. It wasn't just by chance. Um, so all of this horrible conditioning and the body psychotic condition that happens is leading a man to what what poet Robert Bly calls a catabasis. Um, in this book, Iron John, when you're reading a bunch of books about men, you're bound to find some that get it wrong. And this is one of the worst. I honestly don't recommend it. It's he was a leader in the mythopoetic men's movement. Um, and he's a well-lauded poet and a beloved poet, but one of the things he was doing in that movement, maybe the best way to understand this sect of so-called male improvement, is to think of it as like one particular version of like the longing for the days when men were men cliche. So a man on the mythopoetic journey might better understand his frustrations with society and himself, and will certainly find validation in male bonding. So in this, men would literally go on retreat, right? And they'd go and they would appropriate indigenous culture, and they would sit maybe in a sweat lodge, and they would like be one with other men, and trying to sort of reclaim their sort of more more like feral caveman characteristics. And he'll find that validation, but the movement didn't do anything to reject and dismantle patriarchy or white supremacy. So therefore, it was providing merely more of the same to society, and a self-indulgent shirking of responsibility to the man. And that's my own assessment of Iron John, this book, and Robert Bly, and the whole movement, the mythopoetic men's movement. But I think it's so important to engage with voices that make us uncomfortable, and to engage with like points of view that too, because sometimes there's like some common ground we find. And the one thing that I find so valuable in this book, and it's such a minor thing, is this idea of a great fall or descent. And so the man is performing really hard, and he's trying to hold it all together, even if on the inside he's miserable. And Bly says, to a man deeply involved in his work, a catabasis, a fall or descent, can appear without either addiction or ill health. A man does well in his business, lives a sweet life with home and family, enjoys his weekends at Lake Tahoe, and one Sunday morning finds himself on the lawn with a loaded shotgun, about to pull the trigger. He lives, but loses every shred of his former art and life. And this blew my mind, because I just thought, yeah, like my life had fallen apart around me. I was so ill with my eating disorder. I was hitting rock bottom. My career was in shambles, and I was so lucky to be at a point in life where I was going back to college. And that alone is like, okay, we're trying to start again. But I didn't understand the bigger picture the way I started to as I was doing all this research. So, yeah, I love that term that a lot of men go through a catabasis. Um, but how do we then start to see the healing aspect of this book, that about healing, as I mentioned? And I'm obsessed with bell hooks. I love everything she does. And she needs no introduction. But her book, I highly recommend The Will to Change. And I especially love it because it provides more of a perspective of people of color, and Black people in particular. And in one part of this book, she's talking about the power of compassion, and that was something that I brought up earlier in the book, um, or earlier in my talk. Um, and so I just wanted to talk about she says the existence of visionary male teachers who offer males and females spiritual guidance is a constant reminder to us that the hearts and minds of men can be transformed by love and compassion. And Bell Hooks often talks about her work as a love ethic. And that was so important to me. I really adopted that as part of my artist practice and in my writing. So I often talk about this book in a lot of ways. It's like a fun book about grief. It's about disordered eating in boys, but like more than anything, it's a book about love, and it's about the transformative power of that. And so writing this book, working with a teenage protagonist, was really teaching me to be compassionate towards myself and to love myself and to forgive myself. And so those are aspects that Brett has to experience in his story. But there were also aspects in my own life that I, was experiencing through writing this book and my experience in therapy and treatment. Um, Also, there's this really intriguing aspect of this book and in my life about that art making I was mentioning. So Brett writes his own comic books, and this is because he can't face some of the trauma in his past. His art practice is creating these comic book characters in their world mirrors and reflects a lot of that trauma. And it's not till the end of the book. And what that's doing for him is it's allowing him this safe distance from it. And it's allowing him to not have to really process and feel. It's if it's Kid Condor, his character, if he's going through those things, and Brett himself doesn't have to go through the processing and the pain. But it's really intriguing, of course, because by the end of the book, those of you who've read it, and if you haven't, you'll see that he has to write an essay for school, and he eventually writes this personal essay that is incredibly honest, where he's really owning his past and owning his feelings and owning his shame and his struggles. And I just am so, it was one of those moments as a writer where you get there and you're so happy for him that he could get there. I think there's an incredible healing power in art. And so that was helpful for his process, but he also had to develop some granularity around his emotional language. And just to give you kind of a real world example of this, at the same time I was writing this book and working as an artist, I did this series called Condom Fossils, an intimate excavation, it was called. And here's an example of one of the pieces. I didn't know their names. And it was getting into some sexual trauma in my past and some of the gay hookup culture behavior that I was engaged in that sort of resulted from that trauma. And me kind of trying to work through that in a different language before I was ready to talk to my therapist and actually say certain things aloud. I was expressing them through the art. And so that was a good stepping stone, just like it is for Brett, to get to the point where he can say the things that he needs to say to start his processing work. Um, yeah, that brings us back to Brene and the vulnerability. And her very famous definition from Daring Greatly. Vulnerability is based on mutuality and requires boundaries and trust. It's not oversharing, it's not purging, it's not indiscriminate disclosure, and it's not celebrity-style social media information dumps. Vulnerability is about sharing feelings and experiences with people who've earned the right to hear them. Being vulnerable and open is mutual and an integral part of the trust-building process. So in my life, that was really happening in that men's group therapy. I had been very transparent in my writing up to that point about some of my sexual exploits, which seemed like the thing, like, oh yeah, you're a hot mess gay writer. That's kind of a persona that people cultivate. But that wasn't me being vulnerable, right? That was me being outrageous. That was me trying to control the narrative. When I was vulnerable with those other men and with my therapist and with my doctor and things, what I was really getting at is this X thing was painful. This thing was humiliating or shameful, or this was scary and hard or whatever, right? And those are things, as you see right now, I'm not choosing to share with whatever, whoever is listening today. That was only for the people who had earned those stories and trust, right? And so Brett is doing that, is able to start doing that with his therapist and with friends, and that's really helping him to heal. Also, an important lesson he learns has to do with the difference between guilt and remorse. And Dr. Edith Eger, who is a Holocaust survivor, teaches us that our guilt and our shame is keeping us stuck in this place where we can't change and grow, and we can't have compassion for ourselves. And but if we do the hard work to change and to seek forgiveness where we can and to apologize where we need to, and to change our behaviors, that guilt turns into remorse. And that remorse helps us to shape our value system moving forward. So instead of living weighed down by a bunch of guilt about all my own mistakes at this point in my life, I have that remorse, but that remorse has just helped me to like change my value system and become the person that I am today. And that's a person I'm really proud of, right? And that's an aspect of Brett's story as well. He has to try to seek forgiveness with his best friend. And, he doesn't know if he'll succeed at that, but he learns in a kind of an important scene with one of his mentors, one of his teachers, that he can choose to forgive himself, even if Reed doesn't. And we're almost at the end here. I'm obsessed with the work of Desmond Tutu. I've loved him my whole life. And his work has a lot to do with forgiveness as well. So there's this overlap between Dr. Egger and Desmond Tutu. And he was the leader of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa after the fall of apartheid, which allowed people who'd committed these horrible atrocities to seek forgiveness, to state their wrongs and to seek forgiveness rather than being punished in a punitive way. So that lesson is useful to anybody who is feeling kind of horrible about the mistakes that they've made in their lives and wants to change. That like any one of us, no matter how terrible the things that we've done, we can change. And Brett needed to know that in this book. And I needed to know that in my life too, that I could forgive myself and that I could change for the better. And then finally, the last important piece of research I really wanted to talk about around men is Dr. Gloria Anzaldua's work. Brett is mestizo, so he's of mixed indigenous and European blood. And I became really obsessed with Gloria Anzaldua's work in undergrad, and I allowed Brett to become obsessed with her work too, and that really helped him to understand himself. But one of the things that he comes to towards the end is that even though it's really tough dealing with grief, that he is able to carry his mother with him throughout his life. He can kind of hold these two truths that she's gone, but she's also still with him. He can do that. And I'm just gonna end my little talk here with this one, just a little tiny passage from Brett towards the end of the book. He says, of course, this ambivalence may seem hard to reconcile, and it is, but I'm a mestizo, and few are as well equipped as mestizos to wrestle with, juggle, and ultimately honor multiple perspectives. Gloria Anzaldúa says mestizos are awesome divergent thinkers because straddling cultures pushes us to create new, complex ways of seeing ourselves and the world. She calls a state of mind a new consciousness, and it might be our most incredible superpower. So Brett really starts to recognize what is innate within him and his ability to sort of handle the stresses and the grief and the challenges of life. And that really reflects what was going on with me in treatment and writing this book and being the artist, making the art that you saw, all kind of rolled into the same moment in my life. Okay, so I'll stop my screen share. Yeah, thank
Wonderful.
you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Josh. And thank you to all of you who have stuck around. I know this is a hard time in the day, but we still have a few minutes. So we'll dive right in. Please post your questions. And what a rich and wonderful talk. If you haven't read the novel, I think this would be an extra motivation to to do that or to finish it. I'm going to start with a question based on your research presentation, but I invite the audience to ask any questions about the novel itself or the creative process. We have a couple of writers here in the audience. Josh, first of all, thank you so much for sharing all these influences and for defining the terms, for really walking us through these definitions and rethinking of masculinity over the formative period for you, but also how they influenced your work. And my question to you is, can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges, but also some of the rewards of writing or rewriting, in your case, masculinity in the novel, since you rewrite it, I would argue, in such
Mhm.
distinct ways.
Well, I just think there's such power in storytelling as like a tool of social progress and change. So for me, I recognize like I was a teacher of young kids for so many years, right? Uh, and I recognize that sometimes before we can really go out in the world and act in new kind of scary or uncharted ways, if we can see it in the media we consume, so in our stories that we're consuming in particular, um, that is acting as a model and it's giving the reader permission to maybe give that a try himself, right? So that reader might really relate to Brett and be like, oh my God, yeah, I like never talked to my dad about my feelings, right? I never, but when we see Brett, finally able to connect with his new father figure in the book, or be able to open up to his friend Mallory or Reed or whoever, and start to own the things that he's been struggling with, and seek support, um, and even in intimate ways with other boys, right? Like there comes a moment, there's one of my favorites where Brett and Reed just reaches out and holds Brett's hand and he doesn't pull away, right? It's this moment of discomfort and they power through that moment. And to me, that's one of my favorite moments of the whole book because it's like, I'm not trying to create aspirational boys. I want them to be real, but I want them to be clearly capable of moving their own needle. And that helps to move the needle for the reader potentially too.
Thank you. How do you teach your craft and some of these ideas and your own research to undergraduates? Is that a fair question? How do you share this love of learning, but also your immense and wonderful experience teaching Montessori students, right, for many years? And then how do you bring all of this into the classroom, especially
Yeah.
for audiences who may be struggling, for students who may not be quite there yet?
Right. Yeah. I think as a Montessorian, because I hadn't gone down this research path yet, I was so grateful to be working in educational methodology where the very theory itself of Montessori is, one of the most foundational aspects of it is that, children are the key to a future peace. And it can sound a little woo-woo, right? Like peace on earth, right? But peace education is a huge part of what we do in Montessori. And I actually wrote during those years, I wrote a peace education curriculum, because I wanted to focus on different peacemakers. And each month we'd learn about somebody new. And that was my first introduction to Desmond Tutu. And this is many, many years ago. So just trying to be that good Montessorian was like infusing me with certain values that I would need to carry on later. And then now, teaching undergrads, teaching writing, I'm so lucky to be at VCU where we have a lot of freedom, um, even as teaching assistants, to build out our syllabi. And so I am very mindful to like bring in what are the kind of readings, the diversity I'm looking for, readings that touch on men's issues where I can. So sometimes it's like in that reading, you are showing them something about craft, right? Let's pick this apart. For instance, I give a reading from Bell Hooks on men and
Wow.
masculinity, usually. And it's like, how did Bell Hooks achieve what she was trying to achieve and get the point across? But also, I just got people to read, 15 pages or so or whatever, about men, and maybe they're going to be thinking a little bit differently, right? And it's
Mhm.
also about modeling. I'm really open as an educator. I'm really honest about who I am, where I am in my life. I'm not like, I don't try to hide the fact that I'm a teaching assistant, for instance. Like, I don't need to be a professor to have a sense of authority because I show that through my teaching and my actions. And so never leading by ego, but instead like I'm just like you. I'm just a writer on a path, and we're fellow writers in a writers community, and I'm a little further along that path. So I'm going to share with you everything I can, and we're going to be a community here together.
Mhm, mhm. Wonderful. I Some of our colleagues need to leave for 1 o'clock appointments. I have one
Hmm.
last question for you, sort of
Hmm.
bundled up. And for those of you who need to leave, please know that this talk is recorded, so you can find it on our website in the next couple of weeks. So, in a previous reading and discussion you did here at VCU, you mentioned that the trajectory to the publication of this novel has not been very smooth, right? And and so I know there are a lot of aspiring writers, including some of our students. And so in closing, oh, there is actually a a question here from Book Lang. Thank you for this. Which is sort of connected to the previous discussion. And it is, which parallels have you found in both feminism and toxic masculinity? How have they, and perhaps you, experienced them to a positive conclusion? Thank you very much for this question. I'll save mine for last.
Yeah, interestingly enough, some of the research that I got into had to do with like how women are also perpetuating patriarchy and oftentimes not even realizing it, right? Because that girl is conditioned in a particular way and she is conditioned into valuing particular things. Think of moments, right, where like a man might be afraid to be emotional in front of his girlfriend or his wife because of attitudes about like be a man. Those attitudes come from patriarchy, first of all, and they come from other men. But they're so well ingrained, and it's done in such a a subversive way, I guess, that like uh, an insidious way that women often don't even realize that they are perpetuating these issues as well. So the thing where it comes together for me, and I think is so important, is like so often in feminist work, men are being excluded. And I think that men and women have to be, and of course, genderqueer people, non-binary people, we have to be working together, right? If the patriarchy harms all of us, and clearly because of this talk, you can see, ways that it's harming men and boys, and we don't even have to begin to talk about the millions of ways it's harming women and femme people, then we are on this journey together, right? And there has to be room for men to practice behaving differently and for women to practice rethinking what they're looking for maybe in a man. And again, I never would put that on a woman's shoulders like that's your fault. No, I would never do that. Because that if those attitudes exist, they do come down from this societal system that is designed to oppress them.
Mhm. Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And final question, I promise. Building on the success of your novel, the sort of journey to publication, do you have any advice for any aspiring students or aspiring writers? And can you tell us what you're working on at the moment, what the next project is?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say community and persistence are the most important things. People sometimes think of writers as like working in this vacuum, and that does happen sometimes, but that has never been my writer's life or experience. Writing for me was the first avenue into having like real deep friendships in my early 20s. Um, I felt really isolated and alone, and like I couldn't like show people who I was. A lot of repression because what if people reject me for being gay? And so I was hiding a lot, right? But writing allowed me to open myself up to others and to start to trust that others would like and appreciate the person that they were seeing. And that community really helps because you get tons of great critique and you really need people to bounce ideas off of. You need the people that you trust along the way. And you also need the people who hate your work. I love being in writing workshop classes and
Right.
stuff where
Yeah.
it's not necessarily all your best friends. And those
Yeah.
people who really dislike what you're doing, even if their delivery is poor and their critiques, you can like find underneath that, okay, what is there that I can take away from this that might actually help me get further towards my own goals. So always try to build community, always education, treat it like a job. Very rarely do we go into careers without any sort of training. So you need to give it the kind of effort that it warrants if you really want to succeed. And patience and persistence.
Mm.
I had to grow a lot as a human being to write this book. And I had written a bunch of practice manuscripts that didn't make it. And a lot of that was because within me, I couldn't identify it, but there was something not working about those manuscripts. And I didn't push as hard to get them agented. Um, and I was feeling like a failure, right? But the reality was all that time I was paying my dues, I was learning my craft, so that by the time I did all this incredible healing work and was just ready to be my best self on the page, that book just fell into place and it came together really quickly. And then as far as like next project, I'm working on a sort of gay conversion therapy, internalized homophobia story, another young adult story. And that's sort of based on some of my anxieties about my sexuality when I was young. I think queer history is important. So this is set in the 90s. What did it look like to be gay in the 90s, right? And some of the parallels are interesting between that time for gay people and today for trans people, for instance, or non-binary people. So I think that there's a lot of relevance to a story set at that time period for queer youth today. And it's very much me having fun with, like, I'm such an artist about it, right? I really want to push myself creatively. So there's this mashup between action movie tropes and musical tropes. And it's kind of absurdist at times. I'm calling it fantastical realism is kind of the term that I've made up for what I'm trying to do. And will I pull it off? I hope so. But I think that's part of what's necessary for me as a writer is I don't want to rest on my laurels, and I don't want to write a book that is too easy. I want to be the guy who, and I think the proof is in this award nomination recently for the National Book Award. I want to be the guy who's standing out in that way, as someone who's willing to take a lot of risks and to challenge himself and to challenge readers. Because I think being challenged as a reader doesn't always feel good, but there's a lot of richness in your life that can be gained from whatever struggles internally you go through in that challenge.
Yeah. Wonderfully put. Thank you so much for your time. Congratulations again, Josh. And we are keeping all our fingers and toes crossed. And please let us know what
Thank you
happened.
so much.
Good luck with the next novel. I've learned so much about not just the novel, but what went into it. So if you haven't read the novel yet, now is the time. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Josh. Congratulations again. And everyone have a wonderful week.
Thank you. I appreciate you all.